In life, we all encounter obstacles, and those obstacles come in all different shapes, sizes, and forms. The question is, how do we handle those obstacles? Do we attack them head on, or do we allow them to make us quit? Welcome to the No Quit Living podcast, where we aim to motivate and inspire listeners to never give up on themselves, their dreams, or their goals. We will interview successful people from all walks of life as they share their no-quit stories when they had the choice to give up or give in, but they didn't. We thank you for listening, and we hope to be that jolt of positivity as you go for your greatness. Welcome to episode number 135 of the No Quit Living podcast. I'm your host, Christopher J. Worth, and today's theme of the day is struggle. Our quote of the day comes to us from Frederick Douglass. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Today's episode is sponsored by the good people over at West Fair Communications, who publish the Westchester County Business Journal and the Fairfield County Business Journal. These newspapers do a wonderful job in covering all aspects of the business world within two of the most influential markets in the New York metropolitan area. You can also take advantage of their daily news feeds, which keep track on the companies and thought leaders in these important regions. For more information, take a look at www.westfaironline.com. Trust me, once you start reading, you won't quit. It is my pleasure to bring you today's episode. Our guest today, Ashkay Nanavati, has quite an interesting story. From a drug addiction in high school to serving in Iraq, he has led quite the life. Today, he is a best-selling author that teaches people and companies how to look at their struggles and treat them as stepping stones as opposed to roadblocks. I hope you enjoy today's episode. Akshay, I'd like to welcome you to the No Quit Living podcast.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you having me here.
I appreciate you spending some time with us. So the first question I got to ask you is, are you ready to bring it today?
Absolutely, brother. Let's do it.
So the number one objective of our show is to motivate and inspire listeners to never give up. And I was curious if you had either a personal story about perseverance or perhaps a challenging time that really tested you, and when you could have given up or given in, you didn't, and you kept on going.
Yeah, I've been blessed to have had a few. In high school, I overcame drug addiction to then join the Marines, despite two doctors telling me Marine boot camp would kill me because of a blood disorder I was born with. So that was one coming into the Marines. But really, I would say my toughest and my best no-quit story would be after coming back from Iraq, spending 7 months out there. I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, struggled with alcoholism that pushed me to the brink of suicide. And hitting that low moment where I thought about just taking my own life was shocking to me, and coming out of that and building myself up from there to where I am today has really been a tremendous journey and a true blessing. So coming out of that was absolutely my biggest no quit moment.
No, that's quite a story, and I appreciate you touching on obviously the sincerity of what it is, and not knowing myself what PTSD is as far as understanding from a personal experience. I know it's an issue and a challenge that as a country we have a lot of thoughts and beliefs different ways. But I gotta ask you, what was the concept or what was the reality of those thoughts of suicide into the point and place where you are today? What kept you going? And I guess a very black and white question is, when it comes to suicide, it's either yes or no, as far as you either attempt it or you do it or you don't, and obviously you didn't. But I guess maybe to share with our listeners what was kind of the mindset of during and then after, and again to the level where you're at today, which is very successful in your business.
Yeah. I had woken up from literally 5 days of binge drinking. I got to a point that I would just drink like a liter of vodka a day. I mean, you drink till you pass out, wake up and drink again. And sometimes this would go on for 5 days, then sober up and then drink again. And the pattern finally got to a point where I thought, you know what, there's no point going on because this pattern would never end. And I just pictured myself walking over to my kitchen and grabbing a knife to end it. And it really shocked me, obviously, that I would even think that. And that was really the trigger point for change. I realized something needed to change, obviously. So I started researching neuroscience, psychology, spirituality to heal myself. Initially it was really just to heal my own brain, heal my mind, spirit, and body. And it led me on this deeper quest to really understand, how do we all navigate suffering, because everybody's suffering in their own way. And that's what I learned, the distinction between, in the context of PTSD, for example, that the symptoms of post-traumatic stress are not indicative of a disorder, but we often label it as a disorder. So for example, I struggled with survivor's guilt because I lost a friend in the war even before I left. And I always felt that it should have been me that died instead of him, And And I learned to harness that guilt. I learned to leverage my guilt as something useful. So the most valuable lesson I learned out of all of this is that there are no bad or good emotions. Although we live in a world that demonizes emotions, and that causes more problems than it does anything good. So what I learned is there are no bad or good emotions. There's just emotions, and it's up to us to do something with it. And it's the same thing with experiences. I learned to transform all my experiences and emotions into whatever I want it to be. And by doing that, you have to transcend yourself. You have to realize that we are not our emotions or our thought patterns or our brains. We're something more than that. We can create whoever we want to be. Because if we were all our emotions, we'd all be a neurotic mess, right? Like our emotions fluctuate like crazy. So I realized that I'm not that. And that's what allowed me to separate myself from judging myself about my addictions and say, okay, I can be something more. And what is it that I want to create? And that's what allowed me to step into something greater than myself.
I wanted to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, before we jump into some of that, is just if you tell our
Sure.
listeners a little bit about who you are and what it is you're doing today and from your career perspective, because I think that'll lead into some other interesting conversations too.
Yeah, absolutely. So after I got out of this phase and all the research that I did and my life experience before that, from joining the Marines and climbing mountains in the Himalayas and skiing across polar ice caps and things like that, it led me to this concept that I created called Fearvana. Like nirvana, but here the idea is these two seemingly contradictory ideas, fear and nirvana, are actually very much complementary. And fear is an access point to our bliss, to our growth, and ultimately to enlightenment itself. So after all this research and collecting my life experience and interviewing many people, I wrote a book, Fearvana, recently launched that book in October. And now what I'm building is creating this concept of Fearvana and turning it into a global movement. So I'm in the process of creating like a Fearvana Academy, Fearvana Fitness, Fearvana Festivals, a whole movement and a series of verticals to help people ultimately transcend their fears. And that's what it takes to live a life of bliss and meaning and joy. So that's currently where I'm at. But for a little while there, I was doing one-on-one coaching, creating some digital information products, things like that. But now really scaling it up into this larger vision, like kind of what Sir Richard Branson is to Virgin. My goal is to be that to Fearvana, but in the space of well-being.
I love the space of well-being. I think that's so interesting, and it encompasses so many different things. If you had to define yourself and you could only use one word, what would that word be?
Grit.
I think in 140 some odd recordings, you're the first person I believe that might have used grit, so I love it.
It's the only talent I got. I'm not really talented at writing or anything else. It's just the ability to fight through whatever it takes to get it done. I'm a zero talent person otherwise, so that's really what I have to count on.
So speaking of well-being and some of the things that you're doing, I wanted to get your perspective of what success means to you.
I think success means to me the ability to consistently reach new awakenings. And what I mean by a new awakening is it's a new personal evolution within yourself. So I think struggle is a necessary point to attain that new evolution. It's when you have something create a radical shift in your being, in your doing, in who you are and who you are for yourself and who you are for the world. So often struggle is an access point to that. It can be deep human connections, powerful conversations, surrounding yourself with people who are better than you. That's an access point to that. Seeking out something meaningful and purposeful, consuming yourself in your worthwhile struggle. I call it a worthy struggle. It's your path. It's your purpose in life. These are all access points to reach your new awakenings. And the more you are able to create new awakenings within yourself, the more you are successful, because that's what life is. And every new awakening is a beautiful thing. That's how I know I'm growing and ultimately doing more for myself and for others that I serve.
I love that question because everybody answers it differently, and I think you're the first person that's used the word awakening, and I think that's just neat because it's obviously who you are and what you do. So one of the things that we do on every show is we look to add value to our listeners, and I was curious if you had to have either a personal or a daily or a morning ritual that you swear by that's helped you get to this level of success that you have.
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, I systematize everything. I'm big into systems thinking. So I create checklists for everything I do. Here's my morning ritual. I'm actually reading the checklist off my phone. It says smile and express gratitude, chant for 10 minutes, meditate for 10 minutes, brush my teeth, weigh yourself, drink 1 glass of water with trace minerals, review, visualize, and stay present to the long-term vision, review goals and detailed plan for the day, and a short prayer. I just follow the checklist every time I wake up, and I have a different ritual for the night as well.
Now, is that something that you've taken over many, many years, or is that something that was taught to you, or where did that come from?
It's taken a little while to tweak it, constantly figuring out here's what works, here's what doesn't, here's how to improve it. So it's been a process of learning from others, of course, implementing and seeing here's what works for me and here's what doesn't. So like moving things around, like only recently I moved chanting before the meditation and moved my prayer to the end of my morning ritual. So little things like that, just tweaked as I put it into practice and figure out why I want to move things around. So you have to, the greatest lessons are always in the doing.
That's so true, and I think that's another neat aspect of this show is getting those questions, because although there are some similarities between different guests, everybody has their own little spin on it, and I think it's really neat how you just referenced moving things up one place or down one place, because what happens is people evolve, and I think being a systems guy myself is, even though I'm very systematic in what I do, there are definitely parts of my life where I've changed this, I've changed that, so I appreciate you touching on that. One of the things we often talk about is personal development and moving from one area of your life to the other. And I was curious, assuming the 20-year-old version of yourself would have listened, if you could go back and give the 20-year-old version of yourself one piece of advice, what would that be?
To develop a positive relationship to adversity and suffering. At 20, I had just joined the Marines, and it was the first time I had started to discover the value of struggle, the value of pushing yourself beyond what you think is possible. And I hadn't clarified it and become aware of it to the extent that I am now. But to consistently practice and relentlessly practice engaging suffering, engaging adversity, and to really fall in love with it. That would be a fundamental piece of advice I would have given myself, and to this day I give to anybody who is listening.
No, that is good advice, and one of the things we often discuss in some way is how failures along the way lead you to your next big goal or lead you to your next big thing. So I was curious, speaking of quotes, do you have a favorite quote by any chance?
I have many, actually. One of them, I think, is the one that stands out kind of in the context of what I just said. I'm going to pull it up, actually, is Vince Lombardi's quote. I firmly believe that any man's finest hour, the greatest moment, the greatest fulfillment to all that he holds dear, is when he's lying exhausted in the battlefield, victorious.
No, that's a great quote, and
really live by that ideology.
Yeah, no, Vince Lombardi's got some great quotes, and the cool thing about him too is that obviously he's known in the sports world, but so many of his quotes can also be substituted for business, for life, for relationships. So I appreciate you touching on that for a minute. So I wanted to ask, if you could have dinner with anybody, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
Ooh, good question. Who could I have dinner with, anybody dead or alive? Right now, I guess in the top of my mind, who it stands out, you might have heard this before, and I don't know if it sounds cliche or not, but the Dalai Lama. I've been working on meeting with him. I was blessed to actually have him write the foreword, and I love the Buddhism mentality and take on suffering. And from research as well as my own life experience, the number one problem that needs to be addressed in order to enhance our well-being is our relationship to struggle and transforming struggle into something useful. So I like the Buddhism philosophy on that. Life is suffering. How do we navigate that? So I would love to meet him, and in fact, I'm hopefully working on making that happen in the coming months. So, and to delve deeper into his take on suffering and how do we navigate that.
There's been so many different authors that have been on our show, and not from a perspective of maybe that's all they do, meaning that they are professional writers. But I wanted to ask you, for any of our listeners that are out there that are maybe thinking about writing a book or want to write a book, what was the difference for you in the idea of an idea, concept, a maybe, versus actually going ahead and finishing the book and getting it out there?
Writing a book was honestly one of the hardest things I've ever done for me. I mean, some people writing might be, easy flow. For me, it was brutal. It was an absolute struggle. It took me about 3 years. One was navigating my own demons, definitely some procrastination, a lot of research. I read over 100 books. And, I must have trashed about 100,000 words worth of work to finally get it to what it is. So to anybody who's considering, I would definitely say, I've actually heard some famous author, I can't remember who it was. I think it might've been Paulo Coelho, say, block out 6 months and don't take any longer than that, because who you are will change. One of the reasons why I rewrote pretty much the whole book by the end of it is because I had evolved over that time, So block out that time, start with an outline. So I started with the book proposal for my publisher, and then use that as a template to write my book. And one of the things that I had to do was stop reading other books, especially if you're writing a personal development book. Every time I read a new book, I kept thinking, oh, this is a great idea and it fits in this area, but there's no end to that, right? Like, so I stopped reading other books at one point and just say, okay, what you got is enough. And like following a simple format of story, point, action. So always starting with the story. What's the point of that story? And I like to end it with some actionable material, because one of my big beefs with personal development books is they're not very actionable. It's just ideas. So I try to make my book very actionable, telling the stories, backing everything up with research. And, that story, point, action formula, or another way to put it is why, what, how, now. That's a good formula to follow when you write as well. So what's the why, what's the what, what's the how, and then what's one thing they should go do now after every chapter. Those two formulas were useful for me in writing my book. But yeah, definitely want to block out that time, get clear on the outcome that you want for your audience, and putting yourself in your book, especially if you're writing a personal development story. You really got to own your own story to then share that with the world. And it took me a while for me to own my own story. A lot of what I'm sharing with you about my survivor's guilt, about my addiction, stuff like that is not something I could have shared too long ago. So being able to own my own story was invaluable for my own book.
I love that you touched on that, because it was an interesting perspective of actually going ahead and writing it. And I think what you said is you got to block out that time and you got to stop reading other things, because I think I read a quote somewhere about so many people want to actually write a book, but they don't actually go ahead and do it. And I think sometimes we just need to get out of our own way.
It is scary. I was writing a book about fear, and I was terrified, because I was terrified that I would write the garbage book, that nobody would read it, that people would hate it. I'd get that 1-star review on Amazon, this, that, and the other thing. And the truth is that fear is a good thing. That's what my whole book is about, that fear is a good thing. So what you want to do, if that's, no doubt anybody who's thinking about writing a book but has postponed it or procrastinated on it, there's some fear showing up. So dig deep into that fear. It's not a bad thing if you're scared. Why are you afraid? What are you afraid of? What's the worst case scenario? How do you prepare for that? So because I was afraid of writing a bad book, it led me to writing a better book. Like today, the book that I wrote, I can truly say I'm proud of. And I wouldn't say that for the first version of the book. So because I was afraid, I spent that extra time, and it led to something more meaningful, because I studied from authors who've written good books, like Jack Canfield, the Chicken Soup for the Soul author, Tim Ferriss. How did they do it? How did they market their book? How did they write a good book? And studied that. Those two formulas that I just shared with you, it's not something I randomly came up with on my own, So it was fear that allowed me to create something better, because I always say fear propels you to prepare if you engage and leverage that fear. So it's okay to be scared. It's what you do with it that matters.
I like that. Fear propels you to prepare.
Absolutely.
So speaking of doing some interesting things, I believe when you and I were talking before we went live that you are training for a 310-mile run.
Yes, sir. I'm going to be running this October 310 miles across Liberia. Should be a fascinating and terrifying trip. It's going to be about just over a marathon a day for 10 days, so around 30 miles, a day for 10 to 11 days. That's the vision, and we're doing a whole series of cool things out there. Like one of the vision for this run, because one of my sort of lifelong missions is to run across every country in the world, and really the idea of this is to start telling stories from all these places we go. So I think everybody's got a superhero within them. I call it the Fearvana moments, these Fearvana journeys that everybody's experienced, where they've transcended struggle to do something magnificent, and every human being has overcome their own adversity in their own way. And I want to tell these stories because I think right now, especially, there's so much divisiveness and animosity in the world. And by sharing some of these stories, the vision is hopefully we can break down some of these barriers of otherness that ultimately create all conflict. Show people that whether we're from Liberia or America or South America or Australia, we're all part of the same human family. We have the same fears, the same doubts, the same passions, and we come from one human family. And by telling these stories, hopefully we can show the world that we're one, and together as one, we can do things in a stronger, more powerful way for our collective human family. So that's one part of the vision. We're going to be supporting a project on the ground, building the first sustainable school in post-war Liberia, helping a water project that we're doing out there as well. So we're going to do some really cool things, and it should be a fascinating life experience. And then from there, I got many other runs planned over the next few years as well.
Now, I just want to reiterate what you just said in case some of our listeners are maybe sleeping or not paying attention, but 310 miles across Liberia. I believe you said it averages out to a little bit over 30 miles for 10 days straight, or 11 days. I just want to correct that.
10 to 11 days, depending on giving an extra day, but the idea is 11 days max for those days. Yeah, 310 miles.
Now, at any point, is somebody going to be running behind you with a gun to your head, or you're doing this by choice?
Good question. No, it's absolutely by choice. I mean, it's going to be in its own right. It's an audacious venture, but it's definitely a training ground for some bigger runs that eventually I'll be doing, where I'll be doing 50 to 60 kilometers a day for months and months on end. So this is in it. I mean, in its own right, but this is a training ground for some bigger stuff that I have planned. And I think the cool thing about these runs that I discovered, and I've already done a few runs. As I mentioned, my goal is to run across every country, so I've done 8 so far. I've already experienced the beauty of struggle and how it unites us, how it connects people. Like a quick story, when I was running 55 miles across Luxembourg, I was in the middle of Luxembourg and I ran into this small town. I was really going through a low moment, as it happens when you're running long distances. And I stopped to put a little wrap around my knee. And this gentleman in this very small town, I couldn't even tell you where it was, in Luxembourg, middle of Luxembourg somewhere, he saw me. He didn't speak much English or any English. I didn't speak barely any French. And, I'm a scruffy looking brown guy in middle Luxembourg. He's a white guy. We don't speak the same language, but I showed him on the phone what I was up to. He invited me into his home for water because he saw me struggling. And then when we parted ways, he gave me this big hug, like kind of like a kiss on the cheek kind of thing, and just wished me well. And it was such a beautiful moment of human connection because he saw me suffering, and we didn't speak the same language, different countries, different skin color, different everything. And we bonded in this beautiful way. And I've had so many experiences like that when I ran across Barbados and many others that have allowed me to see that, hey, we really are one human family. And that's why I think suffering brings that out. My gym that I train with, he says, a family that suffers together stays together, which I really love.
That's an awesome story, and I think it's remarkable what you're doing, but not only the physical aspect of it, but bringing those stories and how you take the suffering concept and bring it to life in the sense of using it as a positive. So I really, really appreciate that, and I think it's awesome on the physical side of what you're doing. So one of the things that we focus on at No Quit Living is the word accountability, and I was curious, what does the word accountability mean to you?
Love that. Great. Yeah, I think the word accountability means to me is honoring a commitment. And that means honoring a commitment to and staying accountable to that commitment. It's honoring a commitment to yourself and or to others. That's what it means to me. So when you make a commitment, it's being accountable to that.
No, that's a great definition.
And often we do that more to others than we do to ourselves. Yeah.
No, it's so true.
Go ahead.
No, that's so true. I think so many times, so many people just say something and do it, and the question is, can they hold themselves accountable? And that's one of the things we talk about to the next step is the importance of accountability partners. And I think that's just neat in regards to how it makes sense.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, you had briefly mentioned that you have some things that you're working on, some courses and things that are coming out. Wanted to ask if there's anything else exciting you'd like to share or tell our listeners about.
The run that I'm doing, love, that I'm really excited about. What we're building now, the next immediate Fearvana venture is a Fearvana Academy, which will be a virtual online educational institution for college-age students to teach them some of these concepts that we're creating Fearvana, because they're not learning it. And I think how we approach mental health is very flawed collectively. I don't think most people who are doing it are intentionally, I think they come from a place of love and service, but they're operating from a very bad playbook that causes a lot more destruction than it does good. So with this academy, ultimately what Fearvana, really the ethos is about the whole thing, is to help people find their worthy struggle, live that worthy struggle, and fall in love with every moment of it. So we're creating a whole educational platform to help the younger generation, the next generation, do those things. And I'm really, really pumped about that, because I think they're going through some struggles right now. And I think we can serve them when they learn these, when they get these awareness that they're not really getting elsewhere.
I love that word struggle, and it's something that I think we could, very similar to a couple of words we use, which are challenges and obstacles. And I think the reality, which is kind of some of the thoughts behind the No Quit Living concept and company and podcast, is everybody encounters those struggles. Everybody has challenges. Everybody has those obstacles. And it's not if and when you will encounter them. The question is, what do you do with them? So I'm really glad that you referenced that word struggle.
Absolutely.
Now, before we let you go, I wanted to ask if you have any parting words you'd like to leave with our listeners.
Yeah, I kind of touched on this earlier, but I think the key essential element for the listener, anybody listening, is really to consistently practice developing that positive relationship with struggle. And I know I say this a lot in suffering, struggle, but it's obviously, it doesn't mean that it's all like life is this whole miserable, challenging thing. There's moments of play. And in fact, bringing that play mindset to struggle is such a beautiful thing. Like, I experience lows when I run, I experience lows when I'm building my business, but I love it, because it's all playful. So developing that positive relationship. And one of the fundamental, most powerful ways to do that is exercise. Like a neuroscientist who I researched during my book, he calls exercise miracle grow for the brain. I know you said you love working out as well. So engaging that, tapping into that, it's a great way to develop that positive relationship. And when you do that, like not only will you be able to handle life when it hits you in the face, because as we all know, it does that, but you'll also be able to handle any obstacle standing between where you are now and where you want to be. And there will be obstacles. So practice that and you will really be able to create success, whatever that means for you.
No, I truly appreciate you touching on that. And last question, I promise it's the easiest one. What's the best way for our listeners to either follow you, connect you with you, or see some of the neat stuff that you're working on with your release of that academy?
Fearvana.com. So that's FEARVANA, fearvana.com. Reach out to me. I am here to serve in any way I can.
That is awesome. Well, listen, my man, I truly, truly appreciate not only your time, but what you share with us. And I know we'll be in touch, but definitely wanted to wish you awesome, awesome luck with that run. And I will tell you that there is no possibility that I will ever run 310 miles in a 10 or 11 day period ever, unless my life or someone else closest to me life's dependent on it. But I think it's an amazing accomplishment, and I wish you the best of luck with it, and definitely look forward to speaking with you soon.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate you having me on the show.
Thank you for listening to episode number 135. Akshay was very open with us regarding his story. When he returned after serving in Iraq, he was faced with PTSD, alcohol abuse, and many thoughts of suicide. When the going got tough, he decided to step up. He defined success as the ability to constantly reach new awakenings, a very unique but specific definition. His morning routine is very systematic to what works for him. I believe he is the first guest that discussed smiling and expressing gratitude the first thing in the morning. Akshay is in the process of training for a 310-mile run across Liberia over 10 or 11 days. That in itself is a huge commitment, but he plans on running across many other countries and motivating and inspiring people through stories along the way. In his closing remarks, he shared how it is so vital to practice and develop a positive attitude in relationship with struggle. So my question to you, our listeners, how do you handle struggle? Do you allow it to cripple or incapacitate you, or do you attack it head on? Struggle is unfortunately something that we all encounter throughout our lives. It's not a question of if, but instead it's actually a question of when and how often. I challenge you the next time you encounter a struggle, look at it as an opportunity to make it a positive. Dig your heels in, put in the work, and go for your greatness. And lastly, to our listeners, thank you. We truly appreciate your time, and we hope our episodes inspire you to keep on attacking life and never giving up. To quote Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, it's always too early to quit.